Hey, let's start us off with a question. Have you ever heard anyone refer to a book's translation as a localization? No? Then, what sets translation apart from localization? If you ask professional localizers and their defenders across the internet, they will tell you something to the effect that localization serves the purpose of making foreign stories comprehensible to a domestic audience, adjusting syntax, wording, and so on to that end. But do translations not also do that? When you purchase a copy of Homer's Odyssey in English, every single one of them, regardless of who did the translation, it will have made such adjustments, ideally in order to convey the original intent as truthfully as possible. Yet the foreword will always refer to this as a translation done by a translator, not a localizer, despite localization being part of the translation process. So why do the people now translating Japanese games and anime refer to themselves as localizers instead of translators? Well, let's again look at their responses. Though the specifics will vary, they near universally can be broken down as such. One-to-one translation is impossible due to the nuances of the Japanese language. Thus, the complication results in localizers needing to be creative in how they add misogyny Gamergate to every piece of fiction. Some might take the tail end of that sentence in jest, but I assure you, it's no exaggeration. Across the screen, you can see many such examples. The addition of words like bigot and bigotry to Izaki-chan when the character was calling someone a loser. Lines adding commentary about homophobia to Shaman King when the character was merely speaking on the brash behavior of men. The multitude of unfitting insertions into Fata Morgana, such as changing the word tsundere into fragile male ego, altering the text of Twin Star Exorcist to change it from a character saying, "A man who dwells on the past is not popular with the ladies," to "mansplainers are not popular with the ladies." Animation fares no differently. If you watched the last season of The Dangers in My Heart, you would have been subjected to just the same, with one such example involving a line where the main character originally excitedly exclaimed his viewpoint, instead became him saying he was mansplaining to a woman. And I think you get the point. This is but just a tiny snippet of what goes on in the industry, and I have no doubt you've seen more examples in a similar vein to what I just showed. Maybe even from my own coverage, and rightfully so, as you don't need to understand Japanese to already feel an inclination that something is off. More often than not, examples like these completely clash with the actual content or character, as well as being a very obvious injection from the localizer's worldview, instead of merely a poor translation. So they deserve their reputation. However, to solely focus on these would be a disservice to how truly and willfully awful localizers are at their job, as there are political alterations to Japanese works that are even more frequent, although being far more subtle in execution than past examples. To be aware of these, one would often require some knowledge of the source material's original text, whereas the most common case in this category would be the removal of gendered language. So let's get acquainted with some examples. Starting with the Live Alive remake. In our first instance, Lawless in Japanese says, "It's not a woman's place to butt in when a man is setting things straight," where this was then turned to "sometimes you gotta own up to your mistakes. Consequences be damned, am I right?" These aren't totally devoid of the same meaning, but you see how these changes remove something that speaks to the character's personality and beliefs, as well as just being blender text. Then, continuing from the same game, the character Shifu states, alright, no need to get so angry, you're letting your pretty face go to waste," which becomes, "You may rest assured that I will not. It is a good strong name worthy of pride, but pride will lead you astray if you let it, as it did not so long ago." Not only does this example completely remove some cheeky dialogue, which can again be insightful into a character's personality, but it's also removed from the entire point of the original text. Though, let's look at this phenomenon in reverse now, this time bringing us to the Utawa de Rumono series. In this instance, Jagdwald originally says, responding to these is what being a man is all about when receiving praise. However, this was changed to, "Come on, pull it together, show them someone to cheer for." You could argue that the change is minuscule, but you are missing the larger picture then. Let's look at another example from the first game to further establish this point. This time Carlisle says this, "Stop. When a man puts his own life on the line, there's no place for a woman to interfere. Becoming, stop. When a man puts his own life on the line, there's no place for bystanders to interfere. It can be, and often really is that simple, a benign comment that even hints at the idea of gender roles, that one sex should act in a certain way, or take pride in it, as well as other forms of gendered language. It, more often than not, ends up being scrubbed. But there is one last piece of the puzzle to explain both the logic behind and the specifics of how these removals are gone about. However, to understand that, it would be best to speak on something familiar to most people. So let's take a few examples from the newer Fire Emblem games, as they are quite popular. Our first involves a conversation between Sylvain and Lycidia, where originally he stated, "So, Lycidia is not only beautiful, but is also a tolerant woman. Well, I can't let another guy have her now, can I?" Which then gets localized into, "Sweet and tolerant, you never cease to amaze me." So much charm from Sylvain's flirting is just flat out removed, and the interaction becomes dry even if the concept is kept within it. But as important as these more subdued examples are, let's move to a bigger one, this time using engage. Here I've chosen to highlight a conversation between Etty and Gold Mary, where at this point in the exchange, Etty speaks on her body in a prideful manner, stating, "What's popular now are muscular beauties like myself. It's ladies like me that gentlemen seek." Leading to Gold Mary responding with, "Let me be clear, what a gentleman enjoys are women like me." And that's a fact. This conversation was then localized as, "Do you think your perfectly folded clothes are going to help you put a dent in the corrupted?" Gold Mary responding with, "You're looking at the very picture of elegance and grace. My condition defines pristine." This is the same text box. You just wouldn't know that because the conversation had been completely altered to no longer be in reference to the girls bringing up their looks in the argument. I find this particularly interesting because, as previously stated, most changes are done to cover up typical gender roles, where Etty's words are sort of going against them. Though it speaks to her feminine beauty, she talks up how her strength and muscles increase her appeal to men, speaking with pride in her words, in contrast to Gold Mary, who shares a similar sentiment about her own more traditional looks. I think this is both a comedic and frankly fantastic interaction for the characters. But because it even references a gender dichotomy and the idea that girls would want to be liked by men, it gets removed, taking away this moment that gives us insight into these characters and leaves us with flat, worthless text as its replacement, just as all these other examples. Now, the reason we're looking at Fire Emblem is because these characters are the good guys, our heroes, ones that you're familiar with. It's not always the case that gendered language is removed, though there are definitely instances of even villains not being allowed to share what these localizers consider unsavory views. But the thing is, oftentimes, it's the protagonists that are most affected, good people speaking on realistic or traditional views on gender. And it seems to come from the localizers not liking the implication that our leading characters do not share their progressive worldview. Sort of like saying, the silly Japanese probably don't know what they're saying is sexist, so I'll fix that. In fact, Brian Gray openly said just that in a paper titled Responsible Localization, Game Translation Between Japan and the United States. Quote, "In Japanese, these characters come across as endearing, whereas in the West, they come across as very sexist. And these are things that tend to universally get cut when localizing from Japan to the United States, because certainly the writer's intention was not to offend anybody, and that would be offensive." This often, ironically offensive, self-imposed belief that they can elevate the text by filtering it through themselves is something that will continue to pop up. So keep this quote in mind moving forward. These sly political removals aren't limited to just gender language though. For instance, in Grand Blue Versus, a line that once complimented a character's fair skin was changed to instead be saying the character could stand to be a little darker. Because as we all know, being light is seen as bad to these people, as well as the case of Animal Crossing New Horizons, where I've already spoken on the situation that took place in the American localization, which resulted in gendered language and selection being scrubbed from the game, a common occurrence. However, something else you might also find interesting is that most of the made-up holidays, like say Toy Day, do have their proper name in Japanese, with characters wishing you a Merry Christmas. So yes, Christmas and Thanksgiving is a thing in Animal Crossing, just not in the American localization, which is such an absurd statement to say. But it too is becoming a common theme in localization.
Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas, Ojo-san-gata.
Almost every change done by localizers seems to boil down to the removal of culture and personality, whether it be of Japanese origin, human nature, or whatever little made it in of traditional America. But I digress. These are once again just a small snippet. There are about 1 million examples I could have used from any Japanese game that was released, and there are plenty more to come, but we'd be here all day if I continued with this section alone. And it goes without saying that I don't know every instance of this either. There are new examples of both the old and new variety brought to my attention every day, whether it's of my own experience or someone like my good friend Eni, who has made a hobby out of cataloging this stuff. So this should be treated as simply me offering a look into what every release you've played probably has taken away from it by the localization staff in these areas. However, there is one last subsection I would like to speak on, and it's not politically motivated. Instead, it falls into that just briefly mentioned self-important category of changes, and is one of the most rampant in the industry. That's the insertion of corked up dialogue. This tends to come as a result of 2 reasons. One, most simply, is the localizer believing themselves the better writer, thinking they can improve the author's work with their lol so random meme insertion, and the other, one that somehow feels even more malicious, comes from the idea that the Japanese language is stale or that the culture is offensive. Many localizers often cite dismay when seeing common phrases such as shikata ganai, meaning it can't be helped, or traditional phrases like oyome ni ikinai, which means I can no longer become a bride. You can find so many social media posts referencing this, as they seem to take active pleasure in removing the direct meaning from these phrases. At its simplest, these mindsets lead to off-putting changes like the ones you can find commonly in Grand Blue, one such example being Uriel, originally stating mendoku sai, a common phrase meaning how troublesome, which was localized as ugh, what a pain in the pecs. Hilarious. But the counter to this is, as I said, how simple these changes are, and as a result are presented as meaningless. However, that's a poor attempt to sidestep the issue. So to exemplify the problem, let's take a look at the localization of The World Ends With You Neo, that was headed by Matthew Furta. Firstly, we're looking at this moment where Nagai is delivering a threat simply with the words, "I'll strike back." But this was changed to, "and now, my edgy wrath." This makes the dialogue come off as ironic, meta, and quirky, as opposed to the original straightforward delivery. Similarly, a scene where Rinto is giving an explanation, the original dialogue has him state, "I was trying to do the scan thing just now," but it was localized as, "Well, I was just taking my galaxy brain for a test run." In this example, it even oversteps the actual explanation the line was giving, instead fluffing up this and the coming text boxes with this eccentric speaking pattern. The entire game is like this. Trivial lines like, "Oh no, the slip guard is gone here," becomes, "Look, the slip guard's gone. How have they not been sued already?" Every line of the text is punched up in a way to make it more wacky or unserious. And sometimes, people will try to defend this saying it's more flavorful, or stating in some way it fits the characters. But that's again not their right to do, even if I did agree, which I don't. These alterations add up and fundamentally change the character's personality, so of course you think it fits. A person viewing this game in English has an entirely different read on both these characters and the story's tone, so it certainly wasn't done as a service or with respect to the original. And to further that point, we'll now take a look at a rather infamous line, which when accurately translated, would be, "Is curry made by me, a Japanese, not an Indian, authentic?" Whereas, Matthew changed it to, "Can I even call this curry, or is it just culture appropriation?" Leading to midwits on social media running defense in an attempt to argue this insertion of politics is accurate, because they both reference worries concerning culture, yet the meaning here is not the same. The original calls into question the authenticity, as in, is this curry just a cheap knockoff? It doesn't imply that it's offensive that he made curry, or that he shouldn't be allowed to. And further, because there's always a further with these things. The fact that we're having this conversation proves it's a bad translation of the original line in this case. Anyone who reads this is going to rightfully associate tons of political baggage with it, whether they groan or smugly nod their head. Yet this wasn't a politically motivated statement initially, which I'm sure is fairly obvious to anyone and will pull many from the experience, whether the game itself finds this character agreeable or not. And of course, the type of person to use this language just so happens to perfectly align with Matthew's own politics. Much like the rest of the changes in the script, this line was twisted in a way to make it something he would write, whether the script is using his own beliefs or shitty, unfunny Marvel movie tier humor. It's a complete disservice to the original script, even more so than the first game's localization, and defending any of this is disgusting. Moving off The World Ends With You though, I'd like to take a detour to an unholy addition in Grand Blue Verses, having the bros say a line that is some Frankenstein of a Dora the Explorer joke mixed with simping.
Ever noticed the Divine Generals have this aura? Like they're glowing with good vibes?
I want to touchy.
Dude, you mean her sheep, right?
Yeah, bro. We can't afford to raise our rating after all this time. Simper no simping.
Believe in victory.
Where the original line was just, forget it, by the way. However, perhaps the worst offender in this category of changes is the Trails series, particularly by the time it reached the end of the Cold Steel era. With Trails, the entire script for these games has a website dedicated to their localization, made by the team itself, showing the original lines and how they localized them. So if there was any further doubt about how proud these people are of their work, look no further. But it is admittedly a great resource for anyone with even a modicum of Japanese language ability, as it displays just how poor these function as translations. Whether it's them not even realizing Estelle's catchphrase was a thing, to the point that they replaced it with different, quirky dialogue every time it came up, or the other myriad of flaws you can find on every page. However, for the sake of time, we'll focus our overview on one line in particular, one of Erica where she in Japanese simply states, "I can easily, quickly, and thoroughly defeat a stupid old man," whereas the localization became this mouthful. "Underestimate me and I'll thrash you before you can say adult diaper, you dow-faced fart factory. That'll leave you with plenty of time to make it to senior discount night at the country buffet." And Jesus, that hurt to say. But this is the quintessential example of this section, as it has references to country buffets and such that would not be said by a character in this setting. Immature, wacky writing like Fart Factory, and just the general bloat of what was a simple statement in Japanese. This is the norm of localization, and should make you think twice when reading dialogue in games, as this eccentric writing style many associate with Japanese games often doesn't exist in reality. But let's end here with an example that not only encapsulates this section, but perhaps all of our categories to some extent. That would be Gotta Protect Her Cart of Darkness on the Switch. Here the original dialogue stated, "When will I meet this gentleman?" Where Lola received the reply, "He's already nearby. Please join forces with him and save Magical Land." Being localized as, "Champion, how will I recognize her?" Where the reply changed to, "This is the 80s, hun. It's a him, and he's white. Except when he's Asian. It's complicated. You must find the champion. Help him at all costs. Our very survival depends on it." From framing gender norms as offensive, adding their own politics, and quirking up the dialogue, all in a disservice to the original game, Brian Gray and John Riccardi really consolidate the localization process here. So, now that we're all well acquainted, it's time to address what is perhaps the biggest cope in defense of everything we've been talking about up to now. People often throw out the excuse that these cuts and changes are not the localizer's fault, that it's due to constraints imposed by the higher-ups. But look at what I've shown you. It's not a rush job. They're adding so much into the text that doesn't exist from within their worldview, as well as the literal sense. Look at some of the word counts we've gone over. And furthermore, The attempt to gaslight people into thinking it's the evil CEOs doing this is ridiculous. The idea that higher-ups conveniently make localizers put in things that, again, perfectly line up with their own politics, humor, and sometimes personal life is insane. However, to really drive this point home, we've seen proof to the opposite. One such example is of Senran Kagura Burst for the 3DS. As one previous Xseed employee recounts, when they received the project, their co-workers, localizers, immediately began plotting out how they would censor the game, where he was an outlier, citing his respect for the original director. As a result, he pushed and fought against the rest of the team, where even the ratings board and higher-ups saw no issue with the game. So it wasn't any form of authority coming down on this release, but simply the localizer's desire. And thankfully, though there still was some censorship in the end, with ages and such being changed, the content itself was kept, thanks only to this individual fighting aggressively against his peers. Tom Lipschultz is the man behind this story, and who I believe is largely responsible for Xseed's previous good reputation concerning translation, which has deteriorated since his departure. Though it seems his stances didn't always win out on every project he's worked on, it still shows how he stood in contrast to how the rest of the industry operates. So suffice to say, these people are vile. The attempts to push blame on other areas of the industry are simply a result of their own inability to take accountability. It's not that I think a circumstance could never occur where it was a suit pushing changes, but given the way localizers antagonize their critics and take pride in their butchering of Japanese media, it's obvious where the blame lays. Which is exactly how we're getting to the point where machine translation is becoming a bigger topic in relation to localization, as it's not just me or you noticing these changes, but it's also that many companies are starting to take note of consumer reactions, often fixing these alterations, whether they be reversing the hijacking of a character in the Boys Love manga I Think I Turned My Childhood Friend Into a Girl, where the localizer changed a male character into a trans woman, the entirety of Azora Striker Gunvolt script being rewritten, reissues of novels such as Mashoko Tensei and Classroom of the Elite, Blue Archive reversing its early poor localization and censorship, as well as Samurai Maiden, doing just the same. This extends to some earlier examples as well, such as The Dangers in My Heart, where its text was updated to have an accurate translation. So as someone who was involved directly in contacting some of those companies and creators, such as the author of the previously mentioned Boys Love manga, don't let any of these people tell you bringing attention to this stuff and calling out modern localization's problems won't do anything. But further, in the wake of AI, we're seeing companies make even further moves away from the localization process, particularly with the announcement of the Magus Bride receiving an AI translation. Though, let's first clarify some misconceptions that the entire spectrum of those concerned seem to not understand. The reason sites like Anime News Network and others are referring to this as AI is twofold. Current trends means more clicks, and secondly, on social media, you see a lot of fear-mongering over AI, where Anime News Network and Crunchyroll would like to paint this process in a negative light. You will often find their staff is buddy-buddy with localizers, and thus often defends them, as they are part of the same clique. If you're familiar with corruption in the gaming industry, think of these sites as Kotaku and Polygon, often being at odds with the actual user base of the content they promote. Thus, don't trust a lot of what you hear out of the website, as every move is to subvert the industry and further try to ingrain themselves as part of it, this being no exception. The actual process going on is machine translation, yes, but even with the technology improving, the process does not stop there. It is being assisted by a real human in correcting any errors. And with this, we're reaching a point where the Japanese rights holders feel they can release content promptly without the need for a localizer, as the people working with this machine translation are those in Japan. And both bilingual Japanese users and those who have checked out the translation have spoken to the process's promise, even if it's not perfect as of now. Think about it, especially those of you who show bitterness toward the mention of AI. Translation is not a creative field like, say, painting. It is closer to a service with a strict end goal that can be judged objectively, where further, I'd wager near all of you in some form use machine translation regularly when encountering a language you're not familiar with. However, the current flaw in most of these systems is they ignore context. They can't understand it. But technological advancements are bringing us to a place where the AI can come to understand the context, which is why there's such negative coverage. Sites like Anime News Network are mad that they and their friends are one step closer to being cut out, the middlemen. So to summarize, this process is being introduced to help curb piracy, as the product will be released faster, and again, those rights holders are becoming increasingly more aware of the problems on the localization side. It's simply a waste of money. And in a lot of cases, this could consequently result in more control, accuracy, and profit for the original authors, not less. As you can imagine, the localizers themselves are not too happy with this. As such, let's look at what they've given for their concerns. Worries of disrespect for the source material, and possible inaccuracies, as well as chalking it all up to an embarrassing decision strictly for corporate greed. But to that, I have to say, since when have these people, these specific people even, been concerned with accuracy? Through all these years of covering this topic, I have time and time again been met with comments from localizers taking pride in their lack of accuracy, and mocking those who attempt to critique them. Chris Nye, responsible for the localization of the Cold Steel era of the Trails series, Guilty Gear Strive, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, as well as many other titles, had just that to say, stating, "The true joy of localization, really, is seeing what you can get away with." How about the localizer for Bayonetta 3, whose employment list just as well includes the likes of Nintendo and Capcom? They had no issue admitting on Twitter that they had to take matters into their own hands with changing some pretty sexist jokes, further stating a lot of text is written by 50-year-old men, so it helps no one to keep it. How often have we seen Andrew Hodgson justify the addition of unwarranted social commentary and inaccurate text? The answer is too many. In fact, it was as recent as the same month he cried about AI not being faithful to the text. Katrina herself can be frequently found on social media, showing off her translation inaccuracies with pride, whether they be inserting quirky dialogue like yeeted and other memes into anime, where they don't belong, stating she changes text because it's too boring or she disagrees with it, to her further support of other horrendous translation jobs. Katrina was one of the most vocal supporters of the translation of I Think I Turned My Childhood Friend Into a Girl, where the translator simply justified changing Huda from a man to a transgender, by stating it was how she saw the character, not the text itself, nor the author's comments. Then, similarly, Katrina showed support for another incident where the localizer for Onemai openly posted on Twitter about their approach to localization, being to elevate the work by asking, "What would I say in this situation?" altering the text through this view instead of translating it. That's the common theme here, self-obsession and a complete disregard for the original work. The localizer views the original source not as something to faithfully bring over to the audience, but as something to be improved upon by them. So, to be direct, who gives a shit what you would say Anna, or any of these leeches? It shouldn't need to be stated, but both the author and the audience deserve to have the actual text translated over as faithfully as possible. Now, there's a non-0% chance that the reason you ended up here is due to this clip.
Like, that's so outrageous. I don't even believe. Is this true? No, wait, that's great. Or what? No, I don't believe. I want to see it.
What are you wearing that for? Oh, those pesky patriarchal societal demands were getting on my nerves. So I changed clothes.
Give it a week, they'll be begging you to change back.
Huh?
You can come on in if you want.
I mean, I just, this is so outrageous. It's like I refuse to f***ing believe it, but it's right there in front of me. I see it. There it is. That's awful. Like, what?
It's something I've gone over many a time already, which is why I didn't include it in the earlier sections. But it's important to note, Dragon Maid had several changes like this done. Characters talking about slut-shaming, culture appropriation, and much more. Not just the patriarchy lines, even if this one gets the focus for how brazenly it does not fit the character it was attached to. However, something even less touched on is Jamie Machi's justification for her additions throughout the dub script.
So this is more directed at Jamie, but all of you can answer.
Go,
All of
Jamie,
you
go. I'm
have,
excited
like,
about it.
I'm ready to
input
bring
on
down the
this.
room. Let's do
We
it.
need a spotlight.
So
on
Funimation
Jamie.
has come under, let's call it criticism for how they choose to adapt their scripts
Oh,
for
like
a couple
unnecessary
of shows.
hate. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, and a lot of that I feel is directed at you unfairly.
Thank you.
So how would you like to respond to that kind of criticism?
To the
particularly-
criticism, like, I have a vagina, deal with it. Like, it's honestly, that's the truth. I am a woman. I am a funny woman. We are all talented, funny, powerful women. We are out here. It's going to happen. Deal with it. I'm sorry you're not getting laid. It's not about you. Move on.
It's that simple. She's a woman, so you have to listen to her words, not the ones the author wrote. And to say otherwise just means you're a virgin. Really screams to that worry about authenticity issues AI is going to bring into the industry, doesn't it? However, we're not done returning to old clips, as there is one other I'd like to revisit. Back in a 2019 video I featured a recent at the time, Nisa livestream, wherein said livestream, the host had some pretty interesting comments about their localization process to share.
Makes sense, not just in the language, but in the culture that we're trying
It's down.
It's mine!
to convey this in.
Yeah. Sometimes it'll be jokes, Japanese jokes
Form
might
up!
have a
Iron
little
will
different
formation!
values than we do.
Yeah. So things like we try to kind of work around things that might be a little sexist, for example, like in Japanese humor.
Activate fire!
And with those things, we like to try to make it more culturally appropriate
An opening!
for our players.
And that doesn't mean it has to be made less
Let's
funny
go.
either.
No, not at all. We can work in something even better sometimes.
Let's go! Evan Crack!
There it is again, the belief that they're, quote, making something better than the original by changing the actual creator's vision to fit it into how the benevolent localizer thinks the world and every person in it should operate. Now, as you can imagine, that clip did not go over well with just about anybody, other than Redditors, resulting in a press release that stated Nisa does not alter content. We know that's a lie just from examples I've shown you throughout this video. But further, it's another instance of a company being forced to respond due to fans, and continues to show the industry that the relationship and trust with consumers is being strained by localizers' mishandling of properties. Which is why you see localizers more and more frequently putting out excuses and attempting to spin a narrative that runs counter to their actions. The pressure is building, and they're getting desperate for support in an industry and against a community that seems to want them less by the day. But maybe we're both a little desperate now, because I don't think machine translation is ideal. Many others probably wouldn't either, but it's only going to become even more preferable as the technology improves, because the most important distinction between these two methods is the errors with machine translation aren't malicious, and with only one editor in Japan looking over it, there's far less chance for any tampering to occur. I've used machine translation when my Japanese was worse, and still sometimes now I struggle. And in all of those cases, I was able to come to the true meaning even if the road there was a little bumpy. However, with localizers, you're getting fan fiction. You don't know what the hell the text says most of the time. But the funny thing is, I find myself often asking, do the localizers even know what the original says either? That might seem like an odd statement, but let's go back to Katrina, this time using her localization of Dark Gathering. And we're not talking about the typical meme and political based lines, like the inclusion of problematic age gap. We're looking at more benign localizations, and I want that clear, because I'm not saying these are atrocities comparable to what we've gone over previously, but I think in some respects, these are just as insightful. One such line, when translated directly, reads as this: "But we'll probably see something because you seem like you'd be popular," where the MC then replies, obviously not with humans. Katrina localizes this as, "But spirits really like you, so we'll probably see one if we go," with the MC replying, "She's definitely not human." Katrina seems to have been confused about what the final statement was in reference to, resulting in a completely different meaning, as well as losing the joke about the MC's lack of popularity with actual people. and the resulting characterization, very similar to our examples from earlier. But this is not caused by ill will, instead, pure incompetence. It's on the level where later on she mistakes Saturday for Sunday. Now, I don't expect any translator to be perfect, especially speaking as someone who has begun to do so for their own projects, but stuff on this level is so consistent throughout her work on this show and basically every other, yet it's the kind of thing even beginners should catch. However, I just said translator, and we have to remember, we're not dealing with translators, but self-called localizers. It's fairly obvious many of them have a poor grasp of the language, and maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise either. Oftentimes, people who work in the industry see no issue openly speaking about their lack of knowledge of the language, such as Rich Am Tower, one of Nintendo's localization managers, who has also worked for Square and Viz Media. He has numerous deleted tweets brazenly admitting to his lack of knowledge or care. So when you take that into account, it becomes very humorous that these individuals and their defenders often fall back on, oh, just go learn Japanese if you care so much, when criticized. But other than their own lack of skill, there's more to address with this statement. Firstly, that's like sitting down at a restaurant and after paying for your food, the waiter shits on your dish instead of bringing you what you asked for, before promptly screaming that if you're upset by it, well, you should have gone to cooking school. And secondly, I am someone learning Japanese, and what I can tell you is the stronger my grasp on this language becomes, conversely, the stronger I feel disdain for these people. They can't even comprehend that the issue isn't that I, on my own, couldn't experience what the author said, but that it's a problem at its core, that they are debasing others' work. That's how little respect the people in this industry have. And you know what? Let's talk more about that industry, because there's something else that needs to be touched on, as even those who do show concern for Japanese translation often get something wrong. It's frequently posited that localization issues are largely a new problem, but this isn't recent. You can find just as many questionable script changes in the older Fire Emblem entries as the ones we spoke on earlier. Perhaps the specific politics we're seeing now are new, but the standard of Japanese translation when compared to its contemporaries has always been this ungodly mess of poor quality and self-importance. And no, that's not strictly concerning for kids. The historical standard of the localization process is put no better than in an interview about the localization of Skies of Arcadia, where Clayton Volek states, "Yeah, we basically sat down, I did a rough translation of the text, and then threw away the Japanese text. We mapped out the big story beats in each scene and then just watched the cutscenes, and ad-libbed what we imagined each character would say, and then rewrote a lot of the dialogue completely." Clayton would later follow this up with the justification that they found the original script creepy for US audiences. We don't need to look at old interviews though. You can go back to the JRPGs of old yourself, specifically anything by Working Designs if you want a crash course, and you'll find the same unfunny attempts to elevate the script that we see now. All the quirky and wacky references of the time, but with slightly more edge instead of gender commentary. However, all of that said, there is one localizer from this early period I'd like to bring special attention to, for various reasons, and that would be Jeremy Blodstein, the localizer for Metal Gear Solid 1. Jeremy is most likely not the first of his kind to develop a holier-than-thou complex, but he's perhaps the foremost example from this point in time. He's been dubbed such ridiculous titles as the localizer that refuses to be forgotten, and this is because Blodstein often cites himself as a large reason for Metal Gear Solid 1's success, and to this day will take any opportunity to demonstrate why that is, whenever given the chance by the journalist press. So to be generous as possible, let's look at some of those very examples he uses to show how he improved the text. At Psycho Mantis's death, the original line reads as thus: "This is the first time I've ever used my power to help someone. It's strange. Such a nostalgic feeling." Where Blodstein altered it to be, "This is the first time I've ever used my power to help someone. It's strange. It feels kind of nice." He states his reasoning for removing the word nostalgic is because people who feel nostalgic don't usually say that, and instead internalize it, which plain isn't true for one, as this is clearly a decision solely based on how he himself would handle these feelings. And perhaps, no, definitely more importantly, this changes the meaning of the line. In the localization, the viewer would probably come to the understanding that doing a good deed gave Psycho Mantis solace in his passing. But there's more to this line than just that. The nostalgia reference was in relation to his mother. It's not simply about it feeling good, but where it brought him back to in his final moments. This connection for the player to pick up on becomes vastly weaker as a result of Blaustein's improvements. Next, we have a line delivered by Snake, first in Japanese. "I'm just a guy who can only find meaning on the battlefield," where it was then changed to, "I'm just a man who's good at what he does, killing." You find situations like these so often in poor localizations, where they add curse words, or state things more explicitly in an attempt to punch up the script. Yet this change removes both subtlety and narrows the scope of Snake's words, to where it just feels like Blaustein is saying, "Oh yeah, my epic badass one-word sentence about killing is so much better than engaging in the clear themes of the story currently being depicted." Then, finally, is our comparison between these lines in Snake's confrontation with Vulcan. First, the faithful translation. "With that strength, we must have been training in the stick pull and four-man carry." Then Blaustein's, "Yeah, I know it. You must be a real threat in the muck-tuck eating contest." This example is perhaps most insightful for the justification Jeremy gives, stating, "In this example, I threw away the lines that did nothing except inform the reader of two more events that exist in the Alaskan Olympics. Instead, I gave Snake a funnier line that establishes his character." This never really made sense to me, as both lines do speak to Vulcan's physique. The original is just far more fitting, as even if the change was attempting to make Snake come off as a more quippy, sarcastic character, is he calling a man who's more built than Disney's Hercules fat? But I suppose the quality of this joke is besides the point. The fact is, Blaustein has no issue admitting he removed lines anytime he thought he could put in something he felt was better. Further stating, "In addition to jargon, I use this opportunity to flesh out characters every chance I had. Too often in translation, the meaning is kept, but all feeling is lost. It must be added back in by the translator. So I gave Snake amusing quips that were not in the original text." The start of this quote is such an incredibly ironic statement. When you look at the examples he gives, he actively removed feeling in the Psycho Mantis example. And this last, localization, didn't come as a result of the original feeling being lost. He specifically sought to change it because he didn't feel the original line added anything. Which begs the question, do you really trust his judgment? Do you think any localizer should decide what is worth keeping or throwing away? Especially for an unfunny joke that relies on their views of the character, not the creators. Yeah, this all sounds really familiar, doesn't it? And once again, I ask you to keep in mind, this selection of quotes are Jeremy's choices. This is what he put forward to convince you his work was superior. Now, if you've played Twin Snakes, these accurate translations probably feel familiar, as that was how the game was brought to us on the GameCube, because given the poor quality of the original localization, Kojima did not want to work with Blaustein any further, and led the man himself to being far more involved with the Metal Gear Solid translation process, moving forward. Something that Jeremy is clearly still bitter about, as he initially tried to claim Kojima loved his work, viewing it as to why Metal Gear Solid Integral exists, a Japanese release containing the English audio. Further stating, Kojima only came to his later conclusion that the game had been tampered with because someone else convinced him of this. However, it's far more likely that the Westabu Kojima simply wanted Integral because he liked the English voice acting, and upon coming to a better understanding of the script itself, was not happy with how his vision had been altered. This story seems twisted much in the same vein that we've seen localizers do throughout this video, and that's why Blaustein is important. It's not because he's owed anything in relation to Metal Gear Solid's quality as a creation, but it is because he believes himself to be owed. So yes, ultimately, I agree. Blaustein is a localizer that should never be forgotten to time. He exemplifies not only how these individuals don't seek to help bring the creator's vision to the world, but instead to alter that vision into one that mirrors their own, all while their self-importance is used to justify their actions. Something not helped by the mindsets you see pushed online by big creators and websites like Did You Know Gaming. This channel that has amassed over 2 million subs had this to say in their video on Pokemon's translation.
But before we get any deeper into this story, I'd like to point out that translating is an art form, not a science. A translator's skill, personality, and even their hobbies can all affect the way a translation comes out in the end. In a lot of ways, Red and Blue weren't only shaped by Game Freak, they were also shaped by translators like Knob.
We've gone over how this framing it as an art form argument is often used as an attempt to gaslight people into why questionable changes are actually fine, since a translation's accuracy is quantifiable. But this observable tactic is perhaps displayed best in what he immediately follows up this statement with. Take a listen to just some of what he says.
And in Celadon City, there's a house with a Buddhist shrine inside, which Knob changed the description of to make it a Diglett sculpture. To be clear, none of these changes were ordered by Nintendo. Knob changed them all on his own, and he even made some minor changes to series canon. In Japan, there's a scientist in the Selfco building who says there's another Selfco branch along the Pakumanaya Tunguska River in Russia. But in English, the scientist says the other Sylph branch is actually in Tixi, in Russian no man's land, which is located about 1,000 miles distance from the river. Some of Knob's favorite music, movies, and TV shows made their way into Red and Blue as well. A rocket grunt who wants you to join his gang on Nugget Bridge says he's gonna make you an offer you can't refuse, an iconic line from The Godfather. And a hiker in the rock tunnel says, "Hit me with your best shot." Then after you defeat him, he says, "Fire it away." 2 lines from the chorus of Pat Benatar's hit song, "Hit Me With Your Best Shot." But for all the changes Knob did make, there were also some changes he wanted to make, but Nintendo didn't allow. In Viridian City, there's a girl who's nicknamed her Spiro. In Japanese, it's called Oni-chan. To better fit with American culture, Knob changed Spiro's nickname to Britney, named after Britney Spears, so it was something like Britney Spiro. However, the higher-ups didn't like this joke one bit and changed Spiro's nickname to Speary and told Knob that any more of these sorts of shenanigans would end in instant termination.
It's brazen. I don't think any translator or localizer should have the right to censor the games, add in their own personal interests, alter the lore, or any of the further attempts done here by Knob. As I want to reiterate, they make it a point that Nintendo did not ask him to censor certain aspects, where he did so of his own accord. And even worse, I said further attempts because, as you heard, higher-ups would continue to step in and threaten to fire him as he kept altering more of the game. Pushback that Did You Know Gaming frames as a negative. However, despite this mindset at the time, Pokemon shows us what happens when you do not have a director closely watching over these things to step in and get involved, which has been far more standard in these industries given the big disconnection from the creators and the localization process. As Knob, in the words of Did You Know Gaming, eventually acquired more clout within the American branch of the company, so he was able to more heavily alter later games in the series such as Gen 3 and 4. Now keep in mind, this is far from the only time this channel has made stances that state censorship and localization, involving a localizer's own interest being injected over the original vision is a positive. There is even more in this video, citing it as flavor or other similar terms.
Just like most everything made in Germany, their localization was efficient and accurate. It didn't contain too many errors, but also maybe didn't employ as much imagination.
Defense of censorship and poor localization tends to be quite common among Nintendo YouTubers.
Many players weren't too happy with the changes, bellowing censorship. I don't know, you see, a lot of these things don't make sense for the Western world and just don't make sense in context of the game, like Fatal Frame is a horror game.
And I think it's just so insulting that people who revolve their lives around and often make a living off of these works, while claiming to respect them, will go as far as to show dismay when official releases clean up the scripts later, or just support these things being tampered with openly. They just transparently don't actually respect these creations, or the people behind them, other than having some vague nostalgia for being a literal child. But these days, YouTubers are oftentimes no different from the websites and journalists we spoke on earlier, if we're being honest. Who needs integrity, right? It's just about trying to carve a place for yourself and your friends in the industry. It's no shock that Knob works with Did You Know Gaming, is it? So I repeat, this rot isn't new. The industry was founded on it from the very beginning, and has only continued to grow and worsen to become what it is today. Perhaps there's an argument to be made that translation of media doesn't pay well, So of course video games and anime would be left with the dredges, the bottom of the barrel, while anyone truly skilled would be working in other areas, translating manuals for equipment or documents. And this is something I posited many times, when people ask why Japanese translation is so bad. But it's never with the conclusion that they should be paid more. You've seen their mindsets and how they view themselves. Something like that would just further justify their actions. They see what they do as an improvement. You would be rewarding that. If translations were poor simply because of basic errors that could be touched up with more time and care, then yeah, I'd be campaigning for those people to get more respect. Give a raise to the new Star Ocean the Second Story R guys. There's a reason that translation is receiving praise, and it's because it's an outlier in the industry, seemingly made both by genuine fans and ones that respect the work enough to not ego trip, with all of its problems simply being a result of some leftovers that stuck from the original localization. So my reason to bring this up is simply to show how it's an afterthought to the companies, and generally only addressed when they're made aware, which is why we're seeing the further incorporation of machine translation. The localization process is a cheap afterthought, and there is becoming a way to translate these works with both more control, profit, and less issues for the company, while consumers have been given every reason to support this over the past few decades. However, we're not in some win state as I've seen people say, especially as far as video games are concerned. Look at Rune Factory 5. It had its original DLC cancelled so the Western branch could shoddily implement same-sex marriage while making the optimization of the game even worse. Companies like Nintendo, Square, and Capcom have localizers as part of the development process, in the hopes to curb any censorship that would have occurred after the Japanese version finished. Sony gutted their entire Japanese studio. In fact, I have a video on all of this, summarized as the global standard if you're interested in this side of things. But the point is, even if you play Japanese games as intended in Japanese, the influence of these people can still be felt, with many a Japanese user commenting on such things. But this simultaneously isn't me saying this to be a downer. We might not be in a win condition, but like everything else, this can change due to reception. The self-importance of the localizer has allowed it to grow the rot deep in the industry. But we have voices. 2 years ago, I left you with this.
So, I guess that's what I want to leave you with. If this stuff bothers you, there's always something you can do, even if it's as simple as having these conversations, because that's where everything starts.
And now, we're surrounded by Japanese users, YouTubers, and websites, all talking about this topic. And though there might be some negativity to be had in these discussions, for some, as there are definitely people using it more for drama farming than actively caring about these things. Well, I don't see that as a negative. At the end of the day, we brought enough attention to it that it became profitable coverage, and that's progress. I don't know what's going to happen as years pass. Maybe machine translation will be a niche thing and localizers will go back to their own ways. Or maybe it'll simply serve as something to ground them back in reality. Maybe nothing more comes of this other than shining a brighter spotlight on these issues, resulting in more people adding Anki reps to their routine, sowing the seeds for greater change in the future. Or perhaps machine translation really will become more commonplace in the industry. But regardless of whatever that future brings, the specifics are not what this video is truly about. No, this video serves to show why people feel the way they do, and to allow others who might not be in the know come to a greater understanding of the scope of the issue. So, to answer the question I posed at the beginning of the video, the content here should show you why it is truly called localization. Not because one-to-one accuracy is impossible, but for a legitimate translator, the localization part of the translation process is simply using the local language, making it understandable with the end goal being a faithful translation of the text. Whereas, the self-proclaimed localizers do not seek to do this. They perverted a vague term to hide their true intentions, but you've witnessed who they really are today. From the average localizer's self-entitlement, how they contort the author's vision to insert their worldview, and how they justify all of this while belittling anyone who says anything to the contrary, including the original creators. So even if AI isn't ideal currently, This whole situation and every single controversy that took place prior shows that people are sick of this. And on that note, the things that are bringing about change in the industry, whether they be these conversations or the literal cases of retranslation, reissues, decensorship, and so much more that have taken place in recent years. We don't owe it to the people who say, "Why do you care?" or the doomers who tell you you can't change anything. We owe it to everyone continuing to fight these things. So no matter where you fall, if you care about these industries, the works of anime, manga, or games you've experienced over the years, or the ones you have yet to, remember, no matter how much you hate localizers, it's still not enough.